I should never have gone back to Disney, but there was something about the smell of those Grand Floridian corridors, something about the golden shimmer of the chandeliers, something about the way light filtered through those tall windows that kept calling me back, as if Miguel was still there, waiting for me in the dark corners of dreams I could never abandon. It was July 1993 when we took him for the first time. My 7-year-old boy, with those enormous brown eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets in the world, and he was so excited he couldn't sleep the night before, kept asking me if Mickey Mouse was real, if the castles were as big as in the pictures, if he could touch the princesses. I told him yes, that everything was possible at Disney, that it was a place where dreams came true, and now, so many years later, I wonder if that's exactly what happened. His dreams became so real that he disappeared into them forever. It was summer. The Florida heat was suffocating even at 8 in the morning when we checked into the Grand Floridian, and Miguel was bouncing on his toes in that way children do when they can barely contain their excitement. His little hands pressed against the lobby windows overlooking the lagoon, where the ferry boats glided back and forth like white swans, carrying other families to their magical destinations. The lobby smelled like vanilla and something else, something I could never identify, but that seemed to linger in every Disney hotel I'd ever been in. A scent that was both comforting and unsettling, like childhood memories mixed with the artificiality of a place designed to manufacture joy. Miguel had insisted on wearing his new Mickey Mouse ears from the moment we left the airport, and they kept sliding down over his forehead, making him look even younger than his 7 years, more vulnerable somehow, though I didn't think about vulnerability then. I was thinking about magic and wonder, and giving my son the childhood I'd dreamed of, but never had myself. The heat was relentless that first day, the kind of humid, pressing heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin and turns every step into an effort, but Miguel didn't seem to notice. He ran ahead of us down Main Street, USA, his little legs carrying him towards Cinderella Castle like he was being pulled by an invisible string, and I remember thinking how small he looked among all those crowds. How easily a child could get lost in a sea of strangers, all wearing the same excited expressions, all carrying the same bright shopping bags, all following the same paths toward the same dreams. But I pushed the thought away because this was Disney, this was safe, this was the most magical place on earth where nothing bad was supposed to happen, where families came to create memories that would last forever, where children laughed and parents smiled and everyone believed, if only for a few days, that the world was exactly as innocent and wonderful as it appeared to be. Miguel's favorite ride that first day was Pirates of the Caribbean, and he insisted we go on it 3 times in a row, each time gripping my hand tighter during the drops, each time laughing louder at the animatronic pirates and their endless mechanical adventures. I can still hear that laugh, high and pure and filled with the kind of joy that only children possess, the kind of joy that makes adults remember why they once believed in magic themselves. But there was something else I remember about that ride, something that didn't register as important then, but haunts me now. During our 3rd trip through the dark waters, Miguel pointed to one of the shadowy corners where the animatronics didn't reach, where the artificial moonlight didn't penetrate, and he said, "Mama, there's someone watching us from over there." I looked where he was pointing, but saw only darkness. Only the architectural bones of the attraction behind its carefully crafted facade. And I told him it was just his imagination, just the excitement of the day playing tricks on his mind. Now I wonder if maybe children see things we've trained ourselves not to see, if maybe Miguel was seeing something I should have paid attention to, something that was already reaching for him even then. That first night at the hotel, Miguel fell asleep clutching his new Mickey Mouse plush toy, still wearing his ears, his face peaceful in the way only sleeping children's faces can be. And I stood in the doorway of our adjoining room, watching him breathe, watching the rise and fall of his small chest, thinking about how perfect the day had been, how everything had gone exactly as I'd planned. The Grand Floridian at night was different from during the day, quieter but somehow more alive, filled with the soft sounds of distant laughter and music drifting up from the lobby, the gentle whoosh of the monorail passing by outside our window, the subtle creaking of an old building settling into itself. I should have been tired, but I felt oddly energized, almost restless, as if the magic of the place had gotten into my bloodstream and was keeping me artificially awake. I remember walking out onto our balcony and looking across the Seven Seas Lagoon toward the Magic Kingdom, seeing the faint glow of the park's lights painting the night sky in soft pastels, hearing the distant sound of fireworks echoing across the water like thunder from a storm that never quite arrives. The next morning, Miguel was up before dawn, shaking me awake with an urgency that seemed almost frantic, telling me we had to get to the park early. We had to be the first ones there. We had to see everything before it got too crowded. There was something different about him that morning, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, an intensity in his brown eyes that hadn't been there the day before, as if he'd dreamed something during the night that had changed him in some fundamental way. When I asked him what he'd dreamed about, he just shrugged and said, "The castle, Mama. I dreamed about the castle, and someone was calling my name." I laughed and told him it was probably just excitement, just his mind processing all the new experiences from our first day, but there was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy, something about the certainty in his voice that made me wish I'd pressed him for more details. We spent that second day in Fantasyland, riding the gentle rides that seemed designed specifically for 7-year-old boys who still believed in fairy tales. And Miguel was different, more focused somehow, as if he was looking for something specific among all the spinning teacups and flying elephants and cheerful music that never seemed to stop. I kept catching him staring at other children, watching them with an intensity that seemed strange for someone his age. And when I asked him what he was looking for, he said, "Other kids like me, Mama, kids who can hear the calling." I didn't know what to make of that, so I bought him cotton candy and told him not to think so hard, to just enjoy the magic around him. But even as I said it, I felt a small knot of worry forming in my stomach, a mother's intuition telling me that something was shifting. Something was changing in ways I couldn't control or understand. It was during our lunch at the Crystal Palace that Miguel first mentioned the man. We were sitting at a table near the windows, watching Winnie the Pooh and his friends entertain the other families, and Miguel suddenly stopped eating his chicken nuggets and pointed toward the entrance of the restaurant. "Mama," he said, his voice quiet and serious, "that man over there has been following us." I turned to look where he was pointing, but all I saw was the usual crowd of tourists and families, no one who stood out, no one who seemed to be paying any particular attention to us. When I asked Miguel to describe the man, he said he was tall and wearing a dark jacket, and he had sad eyes, and he kept appearing wherever we went, always watching from a distance, always standing just at the edge of the crowds where the shadows fell differently. I told Miguel he was imagining things, that there were thousands of people at Disney World, and it was easy to think you were seeing the same person over and over again. But I made a mental note to pay closer attention, to watch for anyone who might be showing unusual interest in my son. The rest of that day passed without incident, but I found myself constantly scanning the crowds, looking for a tall man in a dark jacket with sad eyes, wondering if maybe Miguel had seen something I'd missed. If maybe a mother's protective instincts should trust a child's observations more than adult logic. We rode Space Mountain and the Haunted Mansion. We watched the afternoon parade and ate ice cream shaped like Mickey Mouse heads. We did all the things that families are supposed to do at Disney World. But underneath it all, I felt a growing sense of unease, as if we were being watched by someone or something that existed just outside the carefully maintained magic of the place. Miguel seemed to feel it too, because he stayed closer to me that afternoon, holding my hand more tightly, looking over his shoulder more frequently. And when we finally headed back to the hotel that evening, he asked if we could leave the connecting door between our rooms open so he wouldn't be alone in the dark. That night, I dreamed about the man Miguel had described, though I'd never seen him myself. In my dream, he was standing at the foot of Miguel's bed, not threatening exactly, but present in a way that felt both protective and ominous, as if he was there to watch over my son, but for reasons I couldn't understand. He had dark hair and those sad eyes Miguel had mentioned, and he was wearing what looked like a Disney cast member uniform from long ago, something vintage and slightly faded, as if he'd been working at the parks for decades, but had somehow been forgotten by time. In the dream, he reached out toward Miguel's sleeping form, not to touch him, but as if he was trying to communicate something, trying to pass along some kind of message or warning, and I woke up with a start, my heart pounding, immediately checking the connecting door to make sure Miguel was still safely asleep in his bed. The third day was when everything changed. We had planned to spend the morning at Epcot, to explore the different countries around the World Showcase, to let Miguel collect stamps in his little passport book and pretend he was traveling around the world in a single day. But Miguel seemed reluctant to leave the Magic Kingdom, kept insisting we should go back to the castle, kept saying there was something he needed to do there, something important he'd forgotten. I tried to convince him that Epcot would be fun, that we could come back to the Magic Kingdom later, but he became increasingly agitated, more insistent, until finally I gave in and agreed to spend one more morning at the Magic Kingdom before moving on to the other parks. We arrived at the park just as it opened, taking the monorail from the Grand Floridian through the early morning mist that hung over the Seven Seas Lagoon like a fairy tale fog. And Miguel pressed his face against the windows the entire ride, watching the Magic Kingdom grow larger and more real as we approached, his breath fogging the glass as he whispered something I couldn't quite hear. When we disembarked at the Magic Kingdom station, Miguel took off running toward the entrance gates with an urgency that seemed almost desperate, and I had to call after him to slow down, to wait for me, to remember that we were supposed to stay together. But there was something driving him that morning, something beyond normal childhood excitement, as if he was being pulled toward something specific, something that existed just beyond my ability to see or understand. We entered the park and Miguel immediately headed toward Fantasyland, moving with the kind of purposeful determination usually reserved for adults with specific agendas, not 7-year-old boys on vacation. I followed him through the familiar pathways, past the spinning teacups and the carousel and the Small World facade, but instead of stopping at any of the attractions, Miguel continued walking until we reached a relatively quiet area near the back of Fantasyland, a place where the crowds thinned out and the carefully maintained magic felt slightly less polished, slightly more real. There was a cast member there, a young woman in a blue dress who looked like she might be on her break, and Miguel walked right up to her with a confidence that surprised me. "Excuse me," he said, his 7-year-old voice serious and polite. "I'm looking for the man with the sad eyes, the one who's been watching me. Do you know where I can find him?" The cast member looked confused, glanced at me with the expression that seemed to ask if I knew what my son was talking about, and I shrugged apologetically and started to explain that Miguel had been imagining things, had been seeing people who weren't really there. But before I could finish my explanation, the cast member's expression changed, became more serious, more concerned, and she knelt down to Miguel's level and asked him to describe the man he was looking for. Miguel described the tall figure with the dark jacket and the sad eyes, the same description he'd given me the day before, but he added new details that made my stomach clench with worry. He said the man had been calling his name in his dreams, had been asking him to come to a special place where children who understood magic could stay forever, where they could be part of the magic instead of just visiting it. The cast member's face went pale, and she glanced at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between concern and recognition, as if Miguel's description meant something to her that it didn't mean to me. She told us to wait there, that she needed to make a phone call, and she walked a few steps away and spoke quietly into her radio. Within minutes, a security officer appeared, followed by someone who introduced himself as a manager from guest relations. and they asked Miguel to repeat his description of the man he'd been seeing. Miguel did so with the same serious precision he'd shown before, and I watched as the adults exchanged meaningful glances, as if they were communicating something they didn't want to say in front of us. Finally, the manager asked if we could come with them to the guest relations office, said they wanted to talk to us more privately, wanted to make sure we were safe and comfortable. I agreed, though I was beginning to feel like we'd stumbled into something much bigger than a child's overactive imagination, something that involved knowledge and procedures I wasn't privy to. The guest relations office was located in a part of the Magic Kingdom I'd never seen before, behind the carefully maintained facades and away from the public areas where magic was supposed to reign supreme. It felt more like a regular office building, with fluorescent lights and beige carpeting, and the kind of institutional furniture that suggested serious business rather than fantasy and wonder. Miguel seemed smaller in that environment, more like a regular 7-year-old boy, and less like someone who might have magical insights about mysterious men with sad eyes. But when the manager asked him to tell his story again, Miguel's account was consistent in every detail, delivered with a certainty that made the adults in the room take notes and exchange more of those meaningful glances. They asked me about our hotel reservations, about our travel plans, about whether Miguel had any history of imaginary friends or unusual sensitivity to strangers, and I answered as honestly as I could while trying to understand why my son's observations seemed to be causing such concern among people who worked at what was supposed to be the most magical place on Earth. Finally, the manager explained that there had been some incidents over the years, some reports of children being approached by someone matching Miguel's description, always in areas where crowds were lighter and supervision was more difficult. They assured me that nothing bad had ever happened, that the reports had always been investigated thoroughly, but they took such things very seriously and wanted to make sure we felt safe and protected during our visit. I asked if they thought Miguel was in any danger, and the manager said probably not, but they'd like to assign a security escort to our family for the remainder of our visit, just as a precaution, just to make sure everyone stayed safe and had a magical time. Miguel seemed excited by the idea of having a personal security guard, as if it was just another part of the Disney experience, another way the park was making him feel special and important. But I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in that small office, a mother's intuition telling me that something was very wrong, that we'd somehow stepped out of the safe world of family vacations and into something darker and more complicated. Our security escort was a man named Tom, probably in his 40s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that seemed designed to make families feel comfortable rather than alarmed. He explained that he would be staying close by, not interfering with our enjoyment of the park, but making sure we remained safe and had help if we needed it. Miguel seemed to like Tom immediately, chatted with him about his favorite rides and characters, and I began to relax slightly, thinking that maybe this was just Disney being extra cautious. Maybe nothing serious was really wrong, and we could still salvage the magical vacation I'd planned for my son. We spent the rest of the morning riding attractions with Tom, following at a discreet distance, and everything seemed normal. Seemed like the Disney experience I'd expected and paid for. Miguel was laughing again, pointing out details on the rides he'd missed before, asking Tom questions about how the attractions worked and whether he'd ever met Mickey Mouse personally. But I noticed that Tom's eyes were constantly scanning the crowds, constantly watching for something or someone. And I realized that whatever had prompted Disney security to take Miguel's reports seriously was still a concern, was still something they were actively watching for. It was just after lunch, while we were watching the afternoon parade from a spot near the castle, that Miguel grabbed my arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a 7-year-old boy. "Mama," he whispered urgently, "he's here. The man with the sad eyes. He's right over there, behind that family with the stroller." "Ubi?" I looked where Miguel was pointing and saw dozens of people, families and couples, and individuals all watching the parade with the kind of rapt attention that Disney entertainment tends to inspire. But I couldn't pick out anyone who seemed out of place or threatening. Tom had noticed Miguel's agitation and moved closer to us, his hand moving to something on his belt that I assumed was a radio. "Where exactly?" Tom asked quietly, following Miguel's gaze toward the crowd. Miguel pointed more specifically toward a spot near one of the shop entrances where the shadows fell differently, where the afternoon sun created pockets of darkness between the bright facades of Main Street. "There," Miguel said, his voice small but certain, "by the door with the red sign. He's wearing the old uniform, the one from the dream." Tom spoke quickly into his radio, using codes I didn't understand, and within moments I saw other security personnel moving through the crowd, positioning themselves at different points around the area where Miguel had pointed. But as they moved into position, as the net of security tightened around the spot where Miguel insisted the man was standing, something strange happened. Miguel's grip on my arm loosened, his tense posture relaxed, and he said, "Oh, he's gone now. He saw them coming and he just disappeared." Tom continued coordinating with his team for a few more minutes, but it became clear that whoever or whatever Miguel had seen was no longer there, if it had ever been there at all. The security team gradually dispersed back into the crowd, returning to their regular duties, and Tom suggested we might want to move to a different area of the park, somewhere with better sightlines and more controlled access. We spent the rest of that afternoon in Tomorrowland, riding Space Mountain and the Carousel of Progress, attractions that felt safer somehow, more contained and predictable than the darker rides in other parts of the park. Miguel seemed to have returned to his normal 7-year-old self, excited about the rides and eager to collect more autographs from the Disney characters we encountered. But I could tell that Tom was still on high alert, still watching the crowds with the kind of professional attention that suggested he took Miguel's sightings very seriously indeed. When evening came, and it was time for the fireworks show, Tom suggested we watch from a VIP area reserved for Disney Club members and special guests, a spot with controlled access and better security coverage. The fireworks that night were spectacular, the kind of grand finale that Disney is famous for, with music and lights and pyrotechnics that transformed Cinderella Castle into something that seemed genuinely magical, genuinely worthy of the dreams and hopes that families brought to this place. Miguel was transfixed, standing between Tom and me, his little hands gripping the railing as he stared up at the explosions of color painting the night sky. But just as the show reached its climax, just as the final burst of fireworks illuminated the castle in brilliant gold and silver, Miguel turned to me with an expression that was both sad and excited, both frightened and determined. "Mama," he said, his voice barely audible over the music and the crowd's applause. "He says it's time. He says I have to go with him now, that this is why we came here, why I was supposed to find him." I felt my blood turn to ice, felt every protective instinct I possessed surge to life, and I grabbed Miguel's shoulders and asked him what he meant, who was talking to him, where this man was supposed to be. But Miguel just smiled, the kind of peaceful, accepting smile that made him look older than his 7 years, wiser somehow, as if he understood something about the situation that I couldn't grasp. "Don't be scared, Mama," he said, reaching up to touch my face with one small hand. "He's not bad, he's just lonely, and he's been waiting for a long time for someone like me, someone who can see him and hear him and understand why he's stuck here. He used to work here a long time ago, but something happened and he couldn't leave, and now he helps children who get lost, helps them find their way to where they're supposed to be." I tried to tell Miguel that he wasn't lost, that he was right here with me where he belonged, but even as I spoke, I could see that his attention was elsewhere, focused on something I couldn't see, listening to words I couldn't hear. Tom had noticed our conversation and moved closer, his radio already in his hand, but before he could call for backup, before I could grab Miguel and pull him away from whatever force was drawing him, my son did something that still haunts me 15 years later. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his Disney identification badge, the little plastic card with his name and our hotel information that all children were encouraged to wear in case they got separated from their families. He held it out toward the darkness beyond the VIP viewing area, toward a spot where the fireworks light didn't quite reach, and he said, "Here, take this so you'll remember me, so you'll know I was here and I understood what you needed." The badge disappeared from his hand, not dropped, not thrown, not taken by anyone I could see, but simply gone, as if it had been accepted by invisible fingers, as if the darkness itself had reached out and claimed this small token of my son's identity. Tom was shouting into his radio now, calling for immediate backup, for all available security personnel to converge on our location. But Miguel was already moving, walking toward that same spot where his badge had vanished, walking with the kind of calm determination that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and why. I ran after him, calling his name, begging him to stop, to wait, to explain what was happening. But it was as if he could no longer hear me, as if the connection between us had been severed by something more powerful than a mother's love or a child's obedience. The crowd from the fireworks show was dispersing around us, families heading back to their hotels with tired children and arms full of souvenirs, creating a chaos of movement that made it difficult for Tom and his team to maintain visual contact with Miguel as he moved through the darkness at the edge of the viewing area. I reached the spot where Miguel had been heading, the place where his badge had disappeared, but there was nothing there except the carefully landscaped gardens that bordered the castle area. Nothing except shadows and the distant sound of the park's background music and the gradually fading echoes of thousands of happy families making their way toward the exits. Miguel was simply gone, as completely and mysteriously as his identification badge had been, leaving behind no trace except the memory of his peaceful smile and his gentle words about understanding what someone needed. The search that followed was immediate and comprehensive, involving not just Disney security, but local police and FBI agents who seemed unsurprised by the situation, as if they'd dealt with similar cases before. They questioned me for hours about Miguel's behavior, about the man he'd been seeing, about every detail of our 3 days at the Magic Kingdom, and I told them everything I could remember, every conversation and observation and moment of unease I'd experienced since we'd arrived at the Grand Floridian. They searched every inch of the park, every building and attraction and backstage area, using dogs and helicopters and technology I didn't understand, but they found no trace of Miguel, no sign of where he might have gone, or who might have taken him. The investigation continued for months, with media attention and reward offers, and the kind of intensive police work that usually turns up something, some clue or witness or piece of evidence that helps solve the puzzle. But Miguel's disappearance remained inexplicable, a mystery that defied rational explanation and left investigators with theories they couldn't prove and questions they couldn't answer. The man Miguel had described was never identified, despite extensive research into current and former Disney employees, despite interviews with hundreds of park visitors and cast members, despite the kind of thorough investigation that usually produces results in missing person cases. I left Florida after 3 weeks of searching, when it became clear that the official investigation had reached a dead end, when the FBI agents started using phrases like waiting for new leads and keeping the case active, the kind of language that really means they've done everything they can and are hoping for a miracle. But I couldn't go home to our regular life, couldn't return to Miguel's room with his toys and books and clothes, waiting for a boy who might never come back, couldn't pretend that anything would ever be normal again. Instead, I moved to a small apartment in Orlando, close enough to Disney World to visit regularly, far enough from my old life to avoid the constant reminders of what I'd lost. For 15 years, I returned to the Magic Kingdom at least once a month, walking the same paths Miguel and I had walked during those 3 days in July 1993, hoping for some sign of him, some clue about what had happened, some indication that he was still somewhere in that carefully constructed world of magic and wonder. I became familiar with the cast members and security staff who knew my story and treated me with the kind of gentle kindness usually reserved for the mentally ill or the deeply bereaved. They never tried to discourage my visits, never suggested that I was wasting my time or holding on to false hope, but I could see in their eyes that they believed Miguel was gone forever, that whatever had happened to him that night in 1993 was beyond their ability to fix or explain. I developed routines during those visits, patterns of behavior that gave structure to my searching and hope to my grief. I would arrive at park opening and walk the perimeter of each land, paying particular attention to the places where crowds were lighter and sightlines were limited, the spots where a child might disappear without being noticed. I would eat lunch at the same restaurants Miguel and I had visited, sitting at tables where I could watch the entrances and exits, looking for faces that seemed familiar or out of place. I would stay until park closing, watching the fireworks from different vantage points, listening for voices that might sound like my son's, feeling for the kind of presence that might indicate he was still there, still waiting for me to find him. The cast members who recognized me started calling me by name, asking about my search, sharing their own theories about what might have happened to Miguel. Some believed he'd been taken by a human predator who'd used the chaos of the fireworks show to escape with his victim, but the complete absence of physical evidence made that explanation unlikely. Others thought he might have become confused and disoriented, might have wandered into a restricted area and been injured or trapped somewhere the searchers hadn't found. But the extensive investigation had covered every inch of Disney property multiple times. A few of the older employees, the ones who'd been working at the Magic Kingdom since the early days, suggested that maybe Miguel had encountered something that existed outside normal explanation, something that belonged to the park's hidden history rather than its public face. It was one of these older cast members, a maintenance worker named Frank, who'd been with Disney for over 30 years, who first told me about the others. We were talking during one of my regular visits in 2005, sharing coffee at a cast member break area where Frank had invited me after seeing me wandering the park with my usual air of desperate hope. And he asked me if I'd ever heard of other children who'd gone missing at Disney World over the years. I told him I'd done some research, had found a few reports of children getting temporarily separated from their families, but nothing like Miguel's complete disappearance. Frank nodded and said that was because Disney was very good at keeping certain stories out of the public eye, very good at making sure that incidents which might damage the company's reputation never became widely known. According to Frank, there had been at least a dozen unexplained disappearances at Disney World since the park opened in 1971, all involving children between the ages of 6 and 10, all occurring during busy periods when crowds were heavy and supervision was difficult. The children were always found within hours or days, he said, but they were found in impossible places, inside attractions that had been closed and locked, in hotel rooms that had been empty and secured, in areas of the park that were completely inaccessible to guests. And when they were found, they had no memory of where they'd been or how they'd gotten there. No explanation for their absence beyond vague stories about meeting a nice man who'd shown them special places where children could play. The children were always physically unharmed, Frank explained, never showing signs of abuse or mistreatment, but they were changed in subtle ways that their families usually attributed to trauma or the stress of being lost. They became quieter, more thoughtful, more likely to stare into corners where nothing was visible and smile at jokes no one else could hear. They developed an intense attachment to Disney characters and stories, an obsession with returning to the parks that seemed to go beyond normal childhood enthusiasm. And they often claimed to remember things about Disney's history that they couldn't possibly have learned anywhere else. Details about the construction of the attractions and the lives of long-dead employees and incidents that had been covered up decades before they were born. Frank said that Disney's policy was to reunite the children with their families as quickly and quietly as possible, to provide counseling and medical care and financial compensation, to do whatever was necessary to prevent the families from talking to the media or filing lawsuits. The company's official position was that the children had simply become disoriented and hidden in places the searchers had missed, that there was nothing supernatural or sinister about their temporary disappearances, that Disney World was and remained the safest place on Earth for families with children. But Frank had been there for all of those incidents, had participated in the searches and seen the children when they were found, and he believed there was something more complicated happening, something that the company either couldn't understand or didn't want to acknowledge. I asked Frank why he was telling me this, why he was sharing information that could presumably get him fired if Disney management found out, and he said it was because Miguel was different from the others. The other children had always been found within 72 hours, he explained, always returned to their families with gaps in their memory, but no lasting harm. Miguel had been gone for 12 years, without any sign or trace, which suggested that whatever had taken the other children had claimed him permanently, that he'd crossed some kind of threshold the others had managed to avoid. Frank thought I deserved to know that Miguel's disappearance was part of a larger pattern, that I wasn't crazy for believing something extraordinary had happened to my son, that my 15 years of searching might actually be based on accurate intuition rather than the delusions of a grieving mother. This conversation with Frank changed the focus of my visits to Disney World. Instead of simply walking the parks hoping to catch a glimpse of Miguel, I started researching the history of the Magic Kingdom, looking for information about employees who died or disappeared, about accidents or incidents that might have left some kind of spiritual residue in the place where my son had vanished. I spent hours in the Orange County Library, reading through old newspapers and magazine articles, looking for stories about Disney World that had never made it into the official company histories. I contacted former employees through online forums and social media, asking them about unusual experiences they might have had during their time working at the parks. What I discovered was a hidden history of Disney World that had nothing to do with magic and wonder, and everything to do with the kind of accidents and tragedies that are inevitable when you build a massive entertainment complex in the middle of a Florida swamp. Workers had been killed during construction. Guests had died on attractions, cast members had committed suicide in backstage areas, and in each case, Disney had worked very hard to minimize public knowledge of these incidents, to maintain the illusion that their property was a place where only good things happened. But according to some of the former employees I spoke with, the deaths and tragedies had left their mark on the Magic Kingdom in ways that couldn't be painted over or renovated away. Several people told me about encounters with figures who didn't belong in the park, cast members who seemed to be wearing outdated uniforms, maintenance workers who appeared in areas where no work was scheduled, guests who seemed lost in ways that went beyond simple confusion about directions. These figures were always described as sad or lonely, never threatening or malicious, but they had a way of approaching children who were sensitive or imaginative, children who might be more open to seeing things that adults had learned to ignore. The encounters usually happened in transitional spaces, areas where the careful theming of the park gave way to more utilitarian architecture. Places where the line between the magical Disney World and the mundane reality beneath it became temporarily blurred. One former cast member, a woman named Sarah, who'd worked in Fantasyland during the 1980s and 1990s, told me about a specific incident that had occurred in 1992, just 1 year before Miguel's disappearance. A 6-year-old girl had approached Sarah during her shift, claiming that a man in an old Disney uniform had asked her to follow him to a special place where children could meet Walt Disney himself. The girl had seemed excited rather than frightened, describing the man as kind and gentle, but Sarah had been alarmed enough to notify security and have the girl returned to her parents immediately. A search had been conducted for the man in the old uniform, but no one matching his description had been found, and no Disney employee had reported making contact with the child. Sarah said that incident had stayed with her throughout her career at Disney, particularly because the little girl had been able to describe details about Walt Disney's personal life and the early days of the company that she couldn't possibly have learned from any public source. The child had known about Walt's private apartment above the fire station on Main Street, about his habit of watching the park from that window during the early morning hours before guests arrived, about his dream of creating a place where children and adults could experience magic together. When Sarah had asked the girl how she knew these things, the child had said that the man in the old uniform had told her that he'd promised to show her the special places where Mr. Disney's spirit still lived and worked. These stories gave me a framework for understanding what might have happened to Miguel, a way of thinking about his disappearance that didn't require me to believe in human predators or random accidents. Maybe he had encountered someone like the figure Sarah described, someone connected to Disney's hidden history who was drawn to children with particular sensitivity to the magical aspects of the place. Maybe his ability to see and hear things that other people couldn't had made him a target for whatever forces existed in the spaces between Disney's carefully constructed reality and the more complex truth beneath it. Maybe his disappearance wasn't a tragedy in the conventional sense, but rather a kind of recruitment, a selection process that identified children who could serve some purpose I couldn't understand. But even if I could develop theories about what had happened to Miguel, I still had no way of finding him, no method for accessing whatever parallel Disney world he might be inhabiting. I continued my monthly visits to the Magic Kingdom, but they began to feel more like vigils than searches, more like maintaining a connection to my son than actually looking for him. I would walk the same paths and eat at the same restaurants and watch the same fireworks shows, but I was no longer expecting to see Miguel's face in the crowds or hear his voice calling my name. Instead, I was simply staying close to the place where he'd vanished, keeping myself available in case he ever found a way to reach out to me, to let me know he was still there and still remembered who he used to be. It was during one of these vigil visits in December 2008, exactly 15 years after Miguel's disappearance, that I finally found what I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. I was staying at the Grand Floridian again, in a room that overlooked the Seven Seas Lagoon, just like the one where Miguel and I had spent our last night together, and I was having trouble sleeping, as I always did when I stayed at Disney World. The hotel was decorated for Christmas, with elaborate trees and garlands and the kind of festive atmosphere that made me think about all the holidays Miguel had missed, all the birthdays and celebrations and ordinary days that had passed without him. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and decided to go down to the lobby to sit in one of the comfortable chairs and watch the night staff go about their quiet work of maintaining the magic for the next day's guests. The lobby was nearly empty at that hour, just a few cast members and a security guard, and the soft sounds of a place settling into itself for the night. I chose a chair near the windows overlooking the lagoon, where I could see the distant lights of the Magic Kingdom reflecting on the water like fallen stars, and I opened a book I'd brought with me. A mystery novel that I hoped might distract me from the anniversary thoughts that always made December visits more difficult than usual. But the book belonged to the hotel, not to me. I'd picked it up from a shelf near the concierge desk where the Grand Floridian kept reading material for guests who'd forgotten to pack entertainment for their vacation. As I opened the book to the first page, something fell out from between the chapters, something small and plastic that landed on the carpet at my feet with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet lobby. I bent down to pick it up, thinking it was probably a bookmark or receipt that another guest had left behind. But when I turned it over and saw what it was, I felt my heart stop and the world tilt sideways around me. It was Miguel's Disney identification badge, the one he'd held out toward the darkness during the fireworks show 15 years earlier, the one that had disappeared from his hand as if it had been taken by invisible fingers. The badge was exactly as I remembered it, with Miguel's name printed in bright blue letters, our hotel information in smaller text below, and a cheerful Mickey Mouse graphic in the corner. But it was also different somehow, aged in a way that suggested it had been somewhere else, somewhere outside normal time and space for those 15 years. The plastic was slightly faded, the colors were a little less bright, and there was a strange warmth to it, as if it had been held by loving hands and carefully preserved by someone who understood its importance. On the back, written in a child's careful handwriting that I recognized as Miguel's, but that was somehow more mature than his 7-year-old script, were the words, "For Mama, so she'll know I'm okay, and I remember her, and I'm still learning about the magic. Love, Miguel." I stared at that badge for a long time, sitting in the quiet Grand Floridian lobby with tears streaming down my face, holding the only physical proof I had that my son still existed somewhere, in some form, in some version of Disney World that operated according to rules I couldn't understand. The message on the back told me that Miguel was okay, that he remembered me, that whatever had happened to him in 1993 hadn't erased his love for me or his identity as my son. But it also told me that he was learning about magic, that he was engaged in some kind of process or transformation that was taking him further away from the boy I'd known and closer to something else, something that belonged to Disney's hidden world rather than the ordinary human reality where I lived. I wanted to run through the hotel and show the badge to someone to prove that Miguel was still there, still reachable, still connected to the place where he'd disappeared. But I also knew that no one would believe me, that the badge would be dismissed as a fake or a coincidence, that the staff would treat me with the same gentle kindness they'd shown for 15 years, while privately thinking I'd finally lost my grip on reality. So instead, I sat in that lobby chair until dawn, holding Miguel's badge and thinking about the message he'd managed to send me, about the love and care that had gone into preserving this small token of his existence and finding a way to get it back to me. When the sun came up and the hotel began to wake up around me, I walked back to my room and packed my things with a sense of completion I hadn't felt in 15 years. I didn't know if I would ever see Miguel again, didn't know if he would ever return to the world where I lived, but I knew now that he was okay, that he was safe, that he had found his place in whatever version of Disney World he inhabited. The badge was proof that love could transcend whatever boundaries separated us, that a mother's connection to her child could survive even the most inexplicable circumstances, that some kinds of magic were real, even if they couldn't be explained or controlled. I still visit Disney World occasionally, but my trips are different now, less desperate and more peaceful. I no longer search for Miguel in the crowds or listen for his voice in the fireworks music. Instead, I simply enjoy the magic of the place, the wonder and joy that drew our family there in the first place, the dreams and possibilities that make children believe anything is possible. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between attractions, in the spaces where the careful theming gives way to something more authentic, I feel a presence that might be Miguel, grown older and wiser but still essentially the boy who held my hand and laughed at animatronic pirates and believed in the reality of fairy tales. I keep his badge in a frame on my desk at home, where I can see it every day and remember that love is the strongest magic of all, stronger than disappearance or time, or the boundaries between the world we can see and the world we can only dream about. Miguel found a way to tell me he was okay, found a way to let me know that our connection survived even the most impossible circumstances, and that knowledge has given me a peace I never expected to find. He's still out there somewhere, still learning about magic, still remembering the mother who brought him to Disney World to see dreams come true, and got more than she ever bargained for. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, and the boundaries between reality and imagination seem thinner, I think I can hear him calling my name, not in distress or longing, but in love and gratitude, letting me know that he's exactly where he's supposed to be. And in those moments, I know that our story isn't over, that love creates its own kind of magic, that some disappearances are really transformations, and that the most important thing any parent can do is trust that their child will find their way to where they belong, even if that place is beyond our ability to follow or understand. Miguel is part of Disney's magic now, part of the wonder and mystery that makes children believe in impossible things, and maybe that was always what he was meant to be. Maybe that's why he could see what others couldn't, why he was chosen for something I couldn't comprehend, why his disappearance wasn't an ending, but rather a beginning of something too beautiful and strange for the ordinary world to contain.